on October 27, 1989, nothing about the day felt unusual. It was a quiet Friday afternoon in Bay Village, the kind of small lakeside community where parents felt safe letting their children walk home from school. The trees were turning. Halloween was only days away. Life was normal. Too normal. 10-year-old Amy Mihaljevic had just finished another school day. She laughed with friends. She made plans. She talked about a surprise she was helping arrange for her mother. Because earlier that week, the phone had rung. On the other end was a man who sounded calm, friendly, confident. He said he knew her family. He said he wanted her to help him select a gift to give to her mother because of her promotion at Trading Times magazine. It didn't sound dangerous. It didn't sound strange. It sounded thoughtful. The caller knew personal details. He knew her mother's name. He knew enough to sound believable. Enough to lower defenses. Enough to make a 10-year-old girl feel trusted, important, included in something grown up. So that Friday afternoon, Amy made a decision that thousands of children might have made in 1989. She agreed to meet him. She walked toward a local shopping plaza, expecting to return home shortly after. She never did. As the afternoon turned into evening, the normal rhythm of suburban life began to crack. Dinner time came and went. The sun went down. And a mother's quiet concern slowly turned into panic. By nightfall, Bay Village was no longer peaceful. It was searching. And what began as a simple phone call would become one of Ohio's most haunting and enduring mysteries, a case that remains unsolved decades later. But who was Amy? Before she became a headline, before her name echoed across television broadcasts and newspaper front pages, Amy Mihaljevic was just a 10-year-old girl growing up in Bay Village, a tight-knit lakeside community just west of Cleveland, tree-lined streets, neighborhood schools, the kind of place where doors were sometimes left unlocked and children rode their bikes until sunset. Amy was bright, friendly, responsible beyond her years. Teachers described her as polite and thoughtful. Friends remembered her as bubbly and kind. She loved animals. She enjoyed school. And like many children her age, she was beginning to navigate that delicate space between childhood and independence. Old enough to feel grown up, still young enough to trust easily. At home, she was especially close to her mother. In 1989, her parents were going through marital strain, something that quietly reshaped her world. It wasn't unusual. But for Amy, it meant wanting to help, wanting to make things better. To investigators later, that wasn't random. It was personal. It suggested someone who understood her family's situation. Someone who knew just enough to craft the perfect story, not just to lure a child, but to reach her emotionally. Amy wasn't rebellious. She wasn't secretive. She wasn't the kind of child who would run away, which made her disappearance even more alarming. Because if Amy agreed to meet someone, it likely meant she believed she was safe. And that belief, that trust, is what makes this case so haunting. Bay Village was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors. Which raises a question investigators still wrestle with. Was the man on the phone really a stranger? Or was he closer than anyone realized? Now, let's talk about the phone call. It started days before October 27th. The calls didn't come in the middle of the night. They didn't sound threatening. They weren't rushed or aggressive. They were calm. The man on the other end spoke with purpose. He probably told Amy that he worked with her mother or was connected to someone who did. Then he added something strategic. He wanted Amy's help. He told her he needed assistance, choosing a small gift for her mother to celebrate the new position. He made it feel like a secret mission, something thoughtful, something grown-up. He wasn't asking her to break rules. He was inviting her to participate. That distinction matters. Investigators later noted how carefully constructed the story was. The caller didn't demand anything. He didn't rush her. He created a reason for the meeting that sounded positive and generous. He also showed knowledge that wasn't random. He knew her mother's name. He knew about the family's situation. He spoke with enough familiarity to lower suspicion. And there's another unsettling detail. Amy told at least one friend about the plan. She wasn't hiding it. She didn't think she was doing something wrong. Which suggests the caller succeeded in one critical objective. He made the meeting feel legitimate. Authorities would later discover that Amy wasn't the only child who received a similar call around that time. Other girls in the area reported a man offering the same story about a gift. Most never agreed to meet. Some told their parents. The man arranged to meet Amy at a shopping plaza after school. Broad daylight, public place. That choice alone added a layer of perceived safety. From an investigative standpoint, the method reveals planning. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't chaotic. It required preparation, selecting a story, choosing a target, placing multiple calls, arranging a time and location. The voice on the phone wasn't just persuasive. It was calculated. And on October 27th, that calculation moved from theory to action. The meeting place was ordinary. A small suburban shopping plaza in Bay Village, a strip of stores people visited every day without thinking twice. Parents hung out there, teenagers hung out there. It was visible, public, familiar, which is exactly why it worked. After school on Friday, October 27th, Amy headed toward the plaza as planned. The timing placed her there in the late afternoon, when the parking lot would still have activity, when daylight remained, when nothing would appear suspicious at first glance. Witnesses later reported seeing her outside one of the stores. She wasn't alone. Several people described a man speaking with her near the entrance. Accounts varied slightly, as they often do, but the image was consistent. A young girl standing calmly with an adult male in a public space. Nothing about the interaction triggered alarm. There was no visible struggle, no shouting, no attempt to flee. From an investigative standpoint, that detail is critical. It suggests familiarity, or at least comfort. Amy did not appear frightened, which reinforces the idea that she believed she was meeting someone safe. Some witnesses would later say the man appeared well-dressed. Others recalled him as clean-cut, composed. The type of adult who wouldn't stand out in a suburban shopping center on a Friday afternoon. Then, at some point, they were gone. The exact moment remains unclear. No one can say precisely which vehicle she entered, or even if she entered one voluntarily in full view of others. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the parking lot had returned to its normal rhythm. Cars pulling in, cars pulling out. And whatever happened next happened quickly. Investigators would later analyze that location with one pressing question. Did the suspect choose the plaza because it felt safe to Amy? Or because he understood that in a busy public place, people assume someone else is paying attention? By early evening, the meeting that was supposed to last minutes had stretched into hours, and the window to intervene had already closed. At first, it was a small concern. Amy was responsible, but children lose track of time. Maybe she stopped to talk to a friend. Maybe she missed a ride. Maybe there was a simple explanation waiting just a few minutes away. Those minutes passed. The light outside began to fade. The normal sounds of evening, dishes, television sets, neighborhood traffic, continued as usual. Inside her home, though, the atmosphere changed. Phone calls were made. Friends were contacted. Parents checked with one another. No one had seen her after the plaza. That's when concern hardened into something else. Law enforcement was notified. Officers responded quickly, treating the situation seriously from the start. This wasn't a child with a history of wandering off. There were no signs of rebellion, no arguments before she left. And then came the detail that shifted everything. She had mentioned meeting a man. That single piece of information reframed the entire situation. Officers returned to the shopping plaza to retrace her steps. They spoke with store employees. They canvassed the area. They tried to reconstruct a timeline from memory alone. because in 1989 there were no digital footprints to follow. As word spread, neighbors stepped outside. Some began searching nearby streets. Others drove slowly through surrounding neighborhoods, scanning sidewalks and intersections. Within hours, the quiet lakeside suburb transformed into an active search zone. Police organized ground searches. Flashlights cut through the dark. Volunteers gathered. Anxiety settled over the community like fog rolling in from Lake Erie. And investigators faced a critical reality. If a child is taken by a stranger, the first few hours matter most. Each passing minute reduces the chances of recovery. By midnight, it was clear this was no misunderstanding, no delayed pickup, no simple mix-up. A 10-year-old girl had vanished in broad daylight from a public place. And somewhere, the man who made that phone call was driving away from Bay Village, unnoticed. The case was no longer about a missing child. It was about a predator who had planned ahead. By the next morning, the search was no longer local. It was regional. Law enforcement agencies across Northeast Ohio began coordinating efforts. Detectives from Bay Village worked alongside county investigators, building a task force almost overnight. What started as a disappearance had become a major case. Roadblocks were considered. Vehicles were checked. Officers canvassed neighborhoods far beyond the shopping plaza, knocking on doors and asking the same question over and over. Did you see anything unusual? Witnesses were re-interviewed in detail. Descriptions of the unidentified man were collected and compared. From those accounts, a composite sketch was created, a face assembled from fragments of memory. The sketch was released to the public. Television stations interrupted programming. Newspapers printed her photograph. Her name spread beyond Ohio, turning a suburban investigation into a headline story. And then came the tips. They poured in by the hundreds. Some callers believed they recognized the man in the sketch. Others reported suspicious neighbors. A few described similar phone calls made to their own children, the same story about a gift. That pattern deeply concerned investigators. It suggested intent. It suggested preparation. It suggested that the caller may have tested his approach more than once. Detectives worked to trace the origin of the phone calls, but technology in 1989 offered limited options. Leads were slow and often inconclusive. Meanwhile, search teams expanded outward into wooded areas, fields, and rural roads. Helicopters were deployed. K-9 units followed every scent they could. Each day without progress increased the pressure. The suspect had a head start. No vehicle description. No confirmed identity. No physical confrontation that left obvious evidence behind. Only a voice, a sketch, and a growing fear that whoever did this had blended back into normal life. Investigators understood something chilling. The man they were searching for could be watching the coverage. He could be listening to the updates. He could be standing in a crowd, unnoticed. And the longer he remained unidentified, the more calculated the crime began to look. More than 3 months passed without answers. Winter settled over Ohio. Snow-covered fields that had already been searched once before, leads slowed. Hope fluctuated between fragile optimism and quiet dread. Then, in February 1990, a man walking through a rural area near Ashland noticed something out of place. What he found would change the course of the investigation forever. Authorities were called to the scene. The area was isolated, farmland and wooded stretches far removed from the suburban plaza where Amy had last been seen. It was roughly 50 miles from Bay Village. The remains were identified as Amy Mihaljevic. The missing persons case officially became a homicide investigation. For detectives, the location raised immediate questions. Why that area? Was it chosen randomly? Or was it familiar to the offender? Did he live nearby, work nearby, travel through it regularly? Crime scene technicians carefully processed the site, collecting clothing and physical evidence that had been exposed to months of winter conditions. Every fiber, every trace, every fragment mattered. The remoteness of the area suggested planning. This was not a hurried disposal in panic. It indicated forethought, a place selected with intention. The emotional toll on the community was profound. For months there had been hope, public searches, prayer vigils, flyers taped to storefront windows. Now there was confirmation of the worst possibility. But for investigators, the discovery brought something else: evidence. And with it, the potential, however small, to identify the man who made that phone call. The focus shifted from finding Amy to finding who had taken her there. And the question that haunted detectives became even more pressing. How does someone commit a crime like this and return to ordinary life unnoticed? With the case now officially a homicide, the investigation narrowed to one crucial objective. What did the evidence say? At the recovery site near Ashland, investigators documented and collected everything they could. Clothing was preserved, soil samples were taken, trace materials were carefully packaged. Even after months exposed to the elements, forensic teams worked meticulously, knowing that a single overlooked detail could mean the difference between resolution and decades of silence. An autopsy was conducted. While authorities withheld many specifics from the public, they confirmed that Amy's death was the result of homicide. The manner and circumstances suggested control, reinforcing earlier suspicions that this crime had been deliberate rather than spontaneous. One detail stood out: her clothing. Items found at the scene did not perfectly match what she had been seen wearing that afternoon at the plaza. That discrepancy sparked difficult questions. Had the suspect brought additional clothing? Was something taken? Was something removed intentionally? Those small inconsistencies became central to the investigative strategy. Forensic testing in 1990 had limitations. DNA analysis was still in its early stages and far from the powerful tool it would later become. Biological samples collected at the time were preserved, but technology would need years, even decades, to catch up. As science advanced, the evidence was re-examined. In the years that followed, investigators submitted preserved materials for updated DNA testing. Partial profiles were reportedly developed. Analysts searched national databases hoping for a match. Someone arrested later for another crime, someone whose genetic fingerprint had finally entered the system. No confirmed match has ever been announced publicly, but officials have repeatedly stated that viable evidence still exists. That fact keeps the case active. Beyond physical forensics, behavioral evidence also played a role. The calculated luring method, the controlled public encounter, the remote disposal site, each piece formed a pattern. Together, they suggested someone organized, patient, and capable of maintaining composure before and after the crime. The evidence doesn't just tell us what happened. It hints at who could have done it. And somewhere within those preserved samples, sealed for decades, investigators believe the answer may already exist. Waiting. Over the years, investigators have examined multiple individuals connected to the region or the Ashland area. None have been charged. Early in the case, tips led detectives to men who resembled the composite sketch or owned vehicles seen near the shopping plaza. Alibis were checked. Employment records were reviewed. Many were cleared after interviews and background checks. Attention later shifted to individuals with prior offenses involving children. Detectives compared timelines, travel patterns, and known behaviors. Search warrants were executed in some instances. Items were seized and tested. No publicly announced forensic match resulted. One investigative angle focused on whether the offender had familiarity with the Ashland area, possibly through work, hunting, property ownership, or routine travel. Men with ties to both locations were reviewed carefully. Another line of inquiry examined whether similar luring calls reported by other families could be traced to a single source. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses years later. No definitive caller was identified. Despite decades of scrutiny, no suspect has met the evidentiary threshold required for arrest and prosecution. The case remains open. After confirmation of her death, Amy's family continued to push for accountability. They cooperated with investigators, participated in media appeals, and supported efforts to keep the case visible. Public statements focused on the need for information rather than speculation. Her mother remained active in outreach for years, urging anyone with knowledge of the crime to contact authorities. The family attended memorial events and maintained contact with law enforcement as the case evolved. Community members in Bay Village organized vigils and remembrance gatherings. Her name remained associated with child safety awareness efforts in Northeast Ohio. Despite the passage of time, the family has not received closure. Their position has remained consistent. Someone knows what happened, and that information has not yet reached investigators. More than 3 decades have passed since October 27, 1989. The evidence remains preserved. The case file remains open. The suspect has never been identified publicly. Advances in forensic science continue to create new opportunities for analysis. A single confirmed DNA match, a credible tip, or a verified admission could resolve the case. For Bay Village and the Mihaljevic family, the objective has never changed: accountability. Someone made the calls. Someone met her at the plaza. Someone transported her to Ashland. That person is either still living with the knowledge or someone close to him is. Cold cases are solved when evidence meets information. Until that happens, this remains an active homicide investigation. And the question stands: who was responsible? If you care about cases that still have answers waiting to be uncovered, if you believe cold cases deserve continued attention, and if you want deep, fact-driven investigations without speculation or sensationalism, subscribe, because some stories fade with time. Others just wait for the right eyes to look at them again. And here, we keep looking.